Africa. 54 countries, over 1,000 languages, 1.2 billion people. We hear a lot in the West about the struggles of Africa. Poverty, war and disease, colonialism, neocolonialism, and exploitation. We hear an awful lot less about the strengths and positive aspects of Africa. The colour, vibrance, food, culture, and, most notably of all, the people themselves. It creates a distorted image of an entire continent in a lot of people's minds. Roughly a third of Europeans are still proud of their country's empires and believe the countries they colonised are better off because of it, largely because of the idea that colonialism civilised Africa, which was perennially portrayed as being primitive and uncivilised. In Chinese video game culture, unlucky or incompetent gamers are referred to as Africans due to an entrenched association in Chinese culture between black faces and bad luck, and in America, the number of people who view Africa as being one big homogenous block, from the pyramids of Giza all the way to the bustling city bowl of Cape Town, and even as literally one country, rather than as an entire continent in some instances, has become almost a meme. People in Tunisia and Lesotho are both referred to as Africans, even though the distance between the two countries is greater than the distance between India and Australia, or London and New York. As a result, when a civil war breaks out in Ethiopia, it tars Westerners' perceptions of Mauritania, over 3,000 miles away, because it's all Africa. In reality, ethnically, socially, and culturally, Africa is the most diverse continent in the world. These same stereotypes and misconceptions have long blighted the greatest event in the African football calendar. The Africa Cup of Nations, or Afcon, is the pinnacle of the African game. Just like the Euros or the Copa America, it pits the continent's finest teams up against one another in a month-long festival of football. And rarely has the term festival, in the context of football, felt more appropriate than with Afcon. The diversity of Africa that I just referenced is represented in all of its glory at the Africa Cup of Nations, both on the pitch and off it. You have the passion and desire of Morocco, which captured the world's imagination at the 2022 World Cup, the experience and sheer star power of Senegal, the excitement and flair of the host nation Ivory Coast, the dynamism and attacking prowess of Nigeria, the pedigree and obsession with this competition of Egypt, the speed and vibrancy of Mali, and the sheer sense of excitement and adventure among minnows like the Gambia and Cape Verde. That this tournament, then, which is as rich and entertaining as any in world football, should be dismissed, treated as a hindrance due to its timing, or even mocked and derided, I think represents a stain on the sport, but much worse than that, it is causing some people to miss out on some genuinely brilliant football. In today's video, I'm going to make it my mission to convince you of that fact. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to Africa, where the Afcon has just kicked off in Ivory Coast, as we take a look at both the perception and discourse that surrounds the Africa Cup of Nations, why it is inaccurate and at times downright offensive, and also some of the fascinating and exhilarating narratives and stories ahead of this Afcon that are routinely overlooked as a result. Over a number of decades, a sometimes subtle and sometimes explicit narrative has been woven about the Africa Cup of Nations. Afcon is portrayed as a tournament which is mired by scandals and corruption, where referees, defending, and goalkeeping are a farce. Not all of that is untrue. Let's just start with the scandals and corruption. It is true that both the Confederation of African Football, or CAF, and the Afcon by extension have been blighted by scandals in the past. I myself made a video 2 years ago, on the eve of the 2021 Africa Cup of Nations in Cameroon, about the many controversies that surrounded that tournament and the build-up to it, so clearly I don't have any issue with people reporting on or covering those issues, otherwise I'd be a bigger hypocrite than Jordan Henderson. Cameroon had first been stripped of 2019 Afcon hosting rights because they failed to deliver promised stadium and infrastructure projects on time, which is why they were pushed back to host in 2021, Ivory Coast to 2023, and Guinea to 2025 as a result. Perfectly legitimate questions were asked relating to COVID denialism, potential safety concerns, and corruption which went right to the top of both the Confederation of African Football and Cameroon's government itself, which has been governed effectively as a one-party state by 90-year-old Paul Biya for more than 40 years. Likewise, at the tournament, when referee Yanni Sikazwe blew for full time after only 85 minutes of Tunisia's group stage tie with Mali, and then again in the 89th minute, it wasn't unreasonable for the world's media to report on it, or for social media to go into overdrive. That would happen if the same thing happened in any major international tournament. The reality, however, is that the same kinds of things, whether that be corruption, controversies, or refereeing howlers, do indeed happen at every other major international tournament. And while they are heavily reported on, they don't tend to undermine those tournaments as a whole. The World Cup remains the most prestigious tournament in world football, and in world sport, in terms of viewership and interest, despite there being an almost unanimous consensus among football fans that FIFA, world football's governing body, and World Cups themselves are laughably corrupt. UEFA is considered to be the world's foremost football confederation, and the Euros the most formidable regional tournament in the international game, despite Michel Platini and Alexander Ceferin successfully having eroded any false pretenses that UEFA had any moral high ground whatsoever over FIFA. And the Premier League is the most popular and prestigious league in world football, despite being a hive mind of some of the most dubious and unscrupulous characters known to man, who now effectively own and administer the league with near total impunity. FIFA's 2015 corruption scandal literally saw its longtime president Sepp Blatter booted out of office and banned, meanwhile 12 members of the organisation's executive committee pled guilty. There are rogue warlords overseeing their own personal fiefdoms at gunpoint who look at the organisation and individuals who run world football and think, "Ooh, I'm not sure about that, mate. It just seems to be a bit too on the nose. Have you thought about maybe being just a little bit more subtle?" And yet, the World Cup, even when hosted in an authoritarian dictatorship, that would be suspended by FIFA and UEFA less than 4 years later for escalating an invasion which they began 4 years before hosting the tournament, or in a gas-rich micro-state with only 300,000 citizens, who hosted the tournament on the back of, at best, indentured servants, has never lost its glisten or gleam. Both off, and, in many instances at least, on the pitch, the history of the World Cup is a history of chaos and corruption. From Mussolini handpicking referees in 1934 to Argentina's right-wing military junta hosting a World Cup final in which some very strange things happened, and Argentina won, within a stone's throw of the dictatorship's torture chambers and various killing fields. But when people think of the World Cup, by and large, they think of Pele, Maradona, and Lionel Messi. They think of the game of the century, Germany thrashing Brazil, Zidane's brace in 98, Baggio's blazed penalty in 94, Bergkamp's touch and finish against Argentina, and Mbappe's ultimately futile hat-trick in the most recent World Cup final. Even when they do think of scandalous and controversial moments, of which there have been many, Zizou's headbutt, Luis Suarez biting Giorgio Chiellini, or Diego Maradona's so-called hand of God, they aren't viewed in the same negative light, casting a shadow on the entire tournament, but rather as abnormal moments, which in some ways only add to the drama and entertainment. Zambian referee Yanni Sikazwe twice blowing his final whistle before the 90-minute mark was a crazy moment. There can be no doubt about it. But was it really any crazier than English referee Graham Poll issuing Croatia's Josip Simjanic with 3 yellow cards at the 2006 World Cup? Yet no one thinks of the 2006 World Cup, in Germany, in which that was far from the only controversy, as being somehow illegitimate or lessened as a competition because of that incident. But for some reason, when African football federations and the Confederation of African Football as a whole are hit with a corruption scandal, or the Afcon has a mad moment of crazy refereeing, it is seen as an indictment of an entire tournament and continent. Yanni Sikazwe, it should really be said, was a FIFA-listed referee for 15 years until his retirement in 2022, who refereed at both the 2018 and 2022 World Cups. He obviously knew how long football matches are supposed to be, but it was later revealed that he had suffered severe heat stroke during the game, resulting in his initially seemingly bizarre lapses in judgment. The Tunisia vs Mali game in which he made those errors was played in 34-degree heat, that is over 93 Fahrenheit for Americans, with 65% humidity inside the ground. In some ways, therefore, it could be argued that Sikazwe's error was more justifiable than Graham Poll's. In the interest of total fairness, it was also 30 degrees in Germany when Poll brandished Josip Simunic with 3 yellow cards, though I have never seen any evidence that he had heat stroke. I will give you another example, this time from the playing side of things. When Virgil van Dijk makes a mistake leading to a goal, it's not as though that mistake is ignored. Quite the opposite, in fact. Because he is such a high-profile player, playing for a high-profile team, it will probably be more heavily highlighted and scrutinised than an equivalent mistake made by a defender at Afcon. However, the target of the criticism, or the butt of the joke on social media, will be Virgil van Dijk, or whoever the offending player happens to be, not the Premier League, Champions League, or European football as a collective. That's a crucial difference, and when you think about it, it is a bizarre one. The same is true of women's football. When a Premier League or Serie A goalkeeper makes a mistake, they are mocked and criticised. When an Afcon or women's goalkeeper makes a mistake, the entirety of African or women's goalkeeping is mocked and criticised. This is just one of the ways in which African football and Afcon are stereotyped. The classic stereotype, of course, despite having so little and, in fact, no basis in fact, is that African players, and black footballers more broadly, have great athleticism, they're quick, strong and powerful, but tactically or technically, they are typecast as being inferior. Analysis of more than 2,000 statements describing light and dark-skinned players by commentators in over 80 Premier League, Serie A, La Liga and Ligue 1 games by the Danish research firm Run Repeat showed light-skinned players were most likely to be singled out for praise for their intelligence, hard work and quality, in direct contrast to darker-skinned players who were much more likely to be singled out for their physical attributes. On average, commentators were 6.5 times more likely to highlight the power of a darker-skinned player compared to a lighter-skinned one, and over 3 times more likely to draw reference to their pace. Of course, there is nothing wrong with highlighting the power of someone like Didier Drogba, the strength of Christopher Samba, or the speed of Adama Traore. That's just doing your job. But the reality is that these references, albeit probably entirely subconsciously, are incredibly selective and racialized. When you have players as gifted as Mohamed Kudus and Riyad Mahrez playing in your own league system, the latter of whom was as far from being powerful as it is possible to be, as slight as a sheet of tracing paper, or previously the likes of Lakhdar Balumi, Nwankwo Kanu and JJ Okocha, as intelligent as Yves Bissouma and Pape-Matar Sarr, the latter of whom is still only 21, and that's just 2 examples from Tottenham, the only explanation for such a nonsensical perception is tired stereotypes and racial categorization. Heck, when Naby Keita joined Liverpool, Danny Murphy profiled him as being a powerful box-to-box player in the mould of Jordan Henderson, when, in actual fact, Keita is a short, skinny and weak midfield creator made out of glass who has quick and tidy feet and an eye for a pass. So, basically, the precise opposite of the African stereotype he was presented as. Arguably Europe's greatest ever centre-forward, and I use the word Europe's in the loosest sense of the term, was Eusebio, who was born and raised in Mozambique to a Mozambican mother and an Angolan father. Eusebio was born in colonial-era Mozambique though, governed by the Portuguese, like fellow Portugal starman Mario Coluna, and so he represented Portugal, scoring 41 goals in 64 games, winning the 1966 World Cup Golden Boot and the 1965 Ballon d'Or. George Weah revolutionised the centre-forward role through his skill and intelligence. Yaya Toure won a Champions League final playing as a centre-back for Barcelona, and a Premier League title in which he scored 24 goals from midfield for Manchester City, and the likes of Marcel Desailly, Patrick Vieira, Karim Benzema and Zinedine Zidane, legends of the European club and international game, were all of African descent. Desailly was born in Ghana and Vieira in Senegal. At the opposite end of the spectrum from the legitimate criticism that is weaponized to discredit an entire tournament and competition, and what I would call lying by omission if the only time Afcon is ever mentioned is to highlight a negative story or a narrative designed to mock it, you also have the arguably even worse outright untruths. Because Afcon is so rarely covered with any kind of depth, thought, or even just the most basic of journalistic standards, not just in the West, but pretty much anywhere outside of Africa, and indeed, at times even within Africa, it makes it incredibly easy to just lie or spin sensationalist and dishonest stories about it without your audience being able to sort the fact from the fiction, because they haven't been equipped with the tools to do so, and the lies and distortions fit neatly into the broader narrative and web of deception and lies that you've cultivated over many years. This is going to sound very arrogant, but if it's any consolation, I am primarily being arrogant on your behalf. If I made a video in which I talked about, let's just say, the entire Ghana team engaging in some wacky or eccentric voodoo practice, jabbing pins into a little effigy of Mohamed Salah in an effort to bring about the Egyptian star's demise, and I had just completely made it all up, an awful lot of you would think, this sounds a bit strange, I haven't heard of this anywhere else, and I'll just have a quick Google to see if this has been reported by anyone else that I trust. And then I would get loads of comments saying, what on earth are you talking about, Alfie? Did you just make that entire segment up? And that is because of the audience that I've cultivated by, for the most part, I think, not lying all of the time, and making several videos talking about so-called fake news stories that have become commonly accepted, particularly online, and explaining how and why that disinformation spread, such as my video about this clip that went viral online, despite the received wisdom about it being the owner's son being a complete distortion, the bizarre, totally implausible, and deeply misogynistic story that spread like wildfire online and was even reported by several supposedly reputable publications about Ashraf Hakimi having put all of his assets into his mother's name, meaning his wife was entitled to nothing when leaving him after he had been accused of rape, and most notably, for me at least, my video about Zaire at the 1974 World Cup and the iconic moment in which one of their players runs out of a defensive wall to take Brazil's attacking free kick, which many people still believe to this day was because he didn't know the rules of football when, in reality, it belied a much darker truth. That last video marked the moment when I started making a lot more video essays and documentary-style videos like this, rather than lists on this channel, due to the response that it got. And it was remarkably similar to this one in terms of addressing a lot of the same narratives and misconceptions about Africans and African footballers. Zaire, now DR Congo, had just won Afcon for the second time in 6 years before that World Cup, and were a trailblazing African team packed full of outstanding players who qualified for the 1974 World Cup as Africa's sole representatives with a remarkable unbeaten qualifying campaign. The idea, therefore, that any of their players wouldn't know the rules of football, including something as basic as the fact that you don't just run out of your own wall and take an opposing team's free kick for them, is probably one of the stupidest and most ludicrous myths in all of world football. And yet, there was a time when, having never really thought about it, because it is just so prevalent, I accepted it as fact, as no doubt will so many of you. But I think that's only really possible for people to be convinced that a brilliant footballer in a brilliant football team doesn't know one of the most basic rules of football when you have decades of dismissal, derision, and baseless stereotypes being repeated about African football ad infinitum. As I said in that video, if that had been a Danish, Canadian, or New Zealander who had done that at a World Cup, despite the fact that they were all worse teams than Zaire at that time, would anyone really have believed, with almost no doubt or hesitation, that they didn't know that they weren't supposed to run out of a defensive wall and take an opponent's free kick for them? Personally, I have a hard time believing that they would, or that a younger version of myself would, and it is worth asking the question of why you would believe it in the case of Zaire, but not Canada or New Zealand. To give another example, if I made a video in which I said a Gabon player had been called before a CAF disciplinary committee ahead of this Afcon to explain why his mother died in 1986, but he was born in 1990, I think a lot of you watching this would question it, unless I could provide substantial and overwhelming evidence. And yet, regrettably, that was one of the biggest stories coming into this Afcon. This exact claim made about Guela Kangakaku was everywhere just days before the tournament began. That's despite the fact that, insofar as there is any truth to the story whatsoever, it is almost 3 years old. Of course, at the Afcon, an open age competition, there would be no point in pretending to be younger than you actually are, an accusation, once again, which is routinely thrown at African footballers who look old for their age, whether there is any evidence of it or not, and in the case of Kanga, the actual story is that in April 2021, the Congolese Association Football Federation, which represents football in DR Congo, filed a complaint against Kanga, who has represented Gabon since 2011, claiming that they had evidence that he was in fact born in DR Congo to Congolese parents and was therefore ineligible to represent Gabon. DR Congo's motive, whether legitimate or not, was because they had missed out on qualifying for Afcon 2021 by 1 point behind the Gambia and Gabon. They hoped that if they could prove that Kanga was ineligible to represent Gabon, Gabon would be deducted points in qualifying and they would therefore qualify ahead of them. All of this context was omitted from the sensationalist stories and headlines about Kanga on the eve of this Afcon, as was the fact that CAF actually dismissed DR Congo's claims, and that all of this happened years ago, which, call me Joseph Pulitzer, but that would seem like quite important context. You might expect this of meme and joke accounts like Troll Football or Football Funnies on Twitter, but you probably wouldn't expect it, or at least could be forgiven for hoping for better, from a group like beIN Sports, a Qatari state-owned broadcaster and one of the largest sports broadcasters in the world, and the biggest in the Arab world, which is chaired by PSG president Nasser Al-Khelaifi, with 1.4 million followers on Twitter. You would be wrong to expect better though, since that is exactly what they did. And I think it's illustrative of the fact that it's not just the West that spreads disinformation about Afcon, though it may be the worst offenders, it is actually a much broader problem. Every time an outlet or publication writes or talks about Afcon, they have the ability to either reinforce or challenge stereotypes about the tournament and African football. Invariably, they choose to reinforce it. So why is this the case? Well, different media organisations have different motives. For some, indeed, I would argue for most, it is all about business. Memeable content is often clickable content, and more clicks means more ad revenue. The narrative around Afcon is already very firmly established. These accounts and organisations have zero interest in challenging it, and even if they aren't actively interested in entrenching those lies and stereotypes, they are perfectly willing to do just that in the name of increasing their revenue. It is a toxic, but largely dispassionate business model, which can lead to some very bad outcomes. Then you have the more sinister players for whom, at least in part, it is ideological. Britain has several unabashedly racist publications who, as numerous studies have repeatedly shown, have zero interest in portraying ethnic or religious minorities in a balanced, nuanced or reasonable way. Their modus operandi is to spread hate and create distortions by any means necessary. It has, for the most part however, become more frowned upon within polite society to just be openly and explicitly racist. It still happens, don't get me wrong, you need only pick up a copy of The Times or The Spectator, though I wouldn't recommend it for your mental health, but as a rule, a subtler sort of racism has become the aim of the game, whereby you exoticize, otherize and dehumanize ethnic minorities, and then pretend to be surprised or claim to just be reflecting the views of your own audience when your readers are shown to be frothing at the mouths racists. Of course, football is far from the sharpest edge of this editorial sword, and football is far from its most harshly impacted victims, but it plays its minor part. The end result is the environment that we all now inhabit, where African football and Afcon is, at best, dismissed and considered an inconvenience and, at worst, fueling the fire of evidence-free racism. We probably spend longer, in England at least, talking about the timing and disruption caused by Afcon than we do about the tournament itself. Don't get me wrong, I don't expect any football fan to jump for joy when they lose a key player during a key part of the season. I mean, this is hardly an abstract concept for me to entertain. My own team, Hull City, have lost Adama Traore and Jean-Michel Seri to this Afcon, the latter of whom is one of our most important players. But even under the mildest of inspection and scrutiny, the timing debate is exposed as being a totally ludicrous one. Afcon is played in the winter rather than the summer, primarily because much of Africa is very hot in the summer. I know, this may come as a shock. Much of it is very hot in the winter, in fact, but even hotter in the summer. Much of Africa, especially around the Horn of Africa and both North and West Africa, are simply much too hot in the summer months to host a major football tournament safely. So what do people want CAF and Afcon to do? Abolish the biggest football tournament in Africa, equivalent to UEFA just unilaterally cancelling the Euros, or just stop calling up players who play in Europe, thus basically defeating the point of the tournament, and denying those players the opportunity to fulfill a lifetime dream. Of course, the 2022 World Cup was also hosted in the winter. Both the 2026 and 2030 World Cups, which are likely to be held in the summer, will be absolutely brutal in terms of temperatures, and then the 2034 World Cup in Saudi Arabia will almost certainly become a winter tournament at some stage, just as Qatar did, whenever FIFA and the organisers finally admit that it's too hot in June and July. At some point, due to climate change, it will probably become a 50-50 split with World Cups being hosted in the summer and winter. And even the Euros, for some countries like Spain, Portugal, Greece, Turkey, and even parts of Italy, will seriously have to consider rescheduling due to extreme heat. We are approaching a situation, therefore, and arguably it has already begun, in which mid-season international tournaments are going to become the norm, and Afcon will just be one of many. Above all else, though, Afcon fits the African football schedule rather than the European football schedule because, it's an African football competition. European teams use Afcon as vital scouting missions, with African players having become the stars of some of Europe's leading clubs in recent years. It is a slightly bizarre form of hypocrisy, therefore, to complain about Afcon coming around after you've signed those players and they have performed so well for you. The reason all of this narrativization matters and is such a shame, though, is because it means that the media, whether that be legacy or social media, or just football fans themselves, inevitably overlook or miss out on so many fascinating storylines and narratives which go virtually unreported. Stories like Zambia's run to the final of the 1994 Afcon, in which they beat Senegal, Mali and Ivory Coast before narrowly losing in the final against Nigeria, less than a year after their entire squad had been killed in a plane crash in Gabon, South Africa's first and only Afcon crown in 1996, just 2 years after the racist system of apartheid had been smashed, in which Bafana won as the hosts with Nelson Mandela in attendance, and, most recently, the Gambia's thrilling run to the quarter-final of the last Afcon in their tournament debuts, following victories against Tunisia and Guinea. The Gambia is a country of fewer than 6 million people, and their squad included 2 free agents at the time and 2 League Two players, Ibu Toure and Ibu Adams, from Salford City and Forest Green Rovers. That is one of the many fascinating things about Afcon, the enormous reputational and financial disparities between players, but how they stand for nothing at Afcon. It is, in many ways, football's greatest leveller, an international equivalent of the FA Cup or Coupe de France. And that makes for endless excitement, the unearthing of hidden gems, and the slaying of numerous giants. Samuel Eto'o, who is undoubtedly one of Africa's greatest ever players, had a dreadful record in Afcon knockout games. Didier Drogba, who is famed as almost the ultimate big game player in Europe, cannot escape the fact that he bottled it, so to speak, in 2 Afcon finals with Ivory Coast. And Mohamed Salah comes into this Afcon, age 31, having yet to be the top scorer, best player, or, most importantly, have got his hands on the biggest trophy in African football, having lost 2 finals, despite playing for the most successful country in the history of Afcon, Egypt, who have won a total of 7 crowns. Salah is already the metaphorical king of Egypt, but if he wants to become football's king of Africa, he is most likely going to have to produce something special over the next 3 to 4 weeks. Nonetheless, Egypt are only the 5th favourites. the hosts, Ivory Coast, the holders, Senegal, the 2022 World Cup stars, Morocco, and their North African rivals, Algeria, are all ahead of them, with Cameroon and Nigeria not far behind. So many Afcon squads are littered with stars. Nigeria have a forward line which boasts Samuel Chukwueze, Alex Iwobi, Moses Simon, and Victor Osimhen, but come into the tournament in relatively poor form. Ghana can call upon the varied talents of Mohamed Kudus, Inaki Williams, and the vastly experienced Ayew brothers. Senegal are capable of naming an entire Premier League midfield of Gay, Kouyaté, and Sarr, bolstered by Ismaila Sarr, Nicholas Jackson, and Sadio Mane in attack. And we are all surely well aware of the talents of this Morocco team by now, with the likes of Bunu, Hakimi, Ziyech, and En-Nesyri. And then, once again, you have the minnows. Afcon is a competition which pits Nigeria, a nation of over 200 million people and the economic powerhouses of Africa, led by one of the best centre-forwards on the planet, on the pitch that is, Victor Osimhen isn't their president, against an island country like Cape Verde, with a smaller population than Sheffield, and players like Roberto Lopez of Shamrock Rovers, and Patrick Andrade of Carabao within their ranks. Surely, all of that is much more interesting than a made-up 3-year-old story about an alleged age dispute. And yet, which one have you heard more about over the last few weeks? Anyway, rant over. And I hope that it wasn't just a rant, because my overriding point is that the Africa Cup of Nations is a rich tapestry of colour, culture, and, above all else, football. If you love football, I don't know how you couldn't love or not get excited about Afcon. International football is now the purest expression of the beautiful game, and Afcon epitomises almost all that is great about it. Thank you all, as ever, for watching this video. Thanks especially to Astor Cerebron, who can be apologies also if I'm pronouncing that wrong, who can be found at @Cerebron on Twitter and via the same username on YouTube. I will put that on the screen now because if I am pronouncing it wrong, you might not know how to spell it. Make sure to check him out. He was of huge use for this video, and I found his videos interesting. I hope that you enjoyed it. Again, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Hit the like button if you did enjoy it. And of course, it goes without saying at this stage, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for both this channel, HITC Sevens, and also my second channel, Alfie Potts Harmer, both of which should be on or right about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one, including that Zaire video that I mentioned earlier on. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Threads via the username @HITC7s on all three, should you wish to do so. And all of those links, plus a whole lot more, should be down in the video description below. Cheers!